Welcome back to Quran by AI. We're going to be diving into a pretty fascinating chapter today. Chapter 10, Jonah. It's packed with, well, parables and warnings and stories from the past. But, one of the things that might surprise some listeners is that this chapter, we think it comes from the early Meccan period. And it grapples with some really big questions about, well, the Quran itself, like its origins, its truth. And it also addresses, some of the pushback that the prophet was getting from people who just didn't believe his message.
Yeah, and one of the ways that it does this is by kind of directly confronting the accusations that are being made against the prophet.
Oh, okay.
Like right away in verse 2,
Okay.
you have this claim that he's like a manifest sorcerer.
Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 38, you have this allegation that he just fabricated the Quran himself.
So, how does the chapter respond to that? How does it try to counter those claims?
Well, it uses a multi-layered approach. I mean, one strategy is to just repeatedly emphasize the Quran's divine origin. So, verse 1 refers to it as coming from the wise book, and then verse 37 describes it as a confirmation of that which came before it, connecting it to, previously revealed scriptures.
So it's kind of creating this sense of continuity and authority, like it's building on what came before.
Yeah. And to further solidify this idea, the chapter makes it very clear that the prophet himself isn't the originator of this message.
Right.
Verses 15 and 16 are really explicit about that. They state that, he's not changing the message on his own. He's just conveying what's been revealed to him.
So it's establishing the Quran as a continuation of this divine message that's coming through prophets, over time. But what about those who still just refuse to believe? How does chapter 10 deal with them?
Well, chapter 10 doesn't shy away from that at all.
Okay.
It uses pretty strong language to warn them about the consequences of their disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
For example, verse 17 states that those who fabricate a lie against God will not prosper.
And then verse 70 warns of a severe punishment for those who persist in their denial.
That's a pretty stark warning. It's interesting, though, that amidst all of this these strong warnings, the chapter also points out this very human tendency to, we turn to God when things are bad, but then when things are good, we kind of forget about him. Yeah. You see this in the parable of the storm at sea.
Oh, yeah. It's illustrated beautifully there in verses 22 and 23.
Yeah, when that ship's about to sink, everyone on board is praying frantically, promising to change their ways. But then as soon as the danger passes, they just go back to their old habits.
It's like they only acknowledge God when they're desperate.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, God, help me. And then as soon as it's over, it's like, okay, never mind.
Right.
And then the chapter goes on to talk about another group, the people who they delay their faith. They're like, well, I'll believe when I see a sign.
Yeah, they're waiting for that grand miracle.
And you see this exemplified with Pharaoh,
right,
where he only claims to believe, when he's literally drowning. And it's too late.
Yeah, so the chapter is making it clear that true faith isn't about waiting for a miracle.
No.
It's not about just turning to God when you're in a crisis.
It's about that consistent trust.
Yeah.
Regardless of your circumstances.
Yeah. But what about the people who they demand proof before they believe? We hear this a lot, even today.
Oh, absolutely. And chapter 10 acknowledges this, in verse 20, the disbelievers, they ask, why has no sign been sent down unto him from his Lord?
Okay.
And the chapter responds in a very interesting way.
Okay, how so?
Well, instead of offering a specific sign or a miracle,
right,
it emphasizes God's control over the unseen.
Mm-hmm.
It says, truly the unseen belongs to God alone. So wait, truly I am among those waiting along with you.
It's like saying, look, the ultimate proof will be revealed in God's time. You just have to be patient. And then we see this point reinforced later in the chapter.
Oh, yeah.
In verse 48. When the disbelievers, they ask again, when will this promise come to pass?
Right.
If you are truthful.
Yeah.
And the response is, say, I have no power over what harm or benefit may come to me, save as God wills.
Mm-hmm.
For every community there is a term. When their term comes, they shall not delay it by a single hour, nor shall they advance it.
So it's all about surrendering to God's timetable.
Right. Trusting in his plan.
Yeah.
Not obsessing over the timing of future events. It's really a message about patience.
Yeah.
And faith.
Yeah. And you know what? One of the most fascinating things to me about this chapter.
Okay, what's that?
Is its exploration of, the nature of faith and disbelief. it offers this really unique insight into the psychology of the people who reject the message.
Yeah, what does it say about why some people they resist?
Well, verse 39 suggests that disbelief often stems from a refusal to actually listen and understand.
It says that, nay, but they deny that whose knowledge they cannot comprehend and whose interpretation has not yet come to them.
It's like they're rejecting it because it doesn't fit into their existing framework.
Right, they're not even willing to try to understand it. And this idea is further developed in verse 99,
Okay.
where the chapter states, "And had your Lord willed, all those who are on the earth would have believed altogether. Wouldst thou then compel men till they become believers? It is not for a soul to believe, save by God's leave."
So that verse seems to highlight the role of free will.
Right.
God invites everyone to the truth,
He does.
but he doesn't force anyone to accept it.
It's a choice.
Yeah, so belief is ultimately a gift from God, not something you can force or coerce. But, this raises an interesting question, like, if belief is a gift, does that mean that some people are just predestined to believe while others aren't?
That's a very complex theological question that chapter 10 doesn't really explicitly answer.
But the fact that it repeatedly calls upon people to, reflect and consider and choose, that suggests an emphasis on human agency.
So while the chapter acknowledges God's ultimate power,
Absolutely.
it also seems to be saying that we have a role to play in our own spiritual journeys.
Yeah, it's a nuanced reading of the text. And this leads to another important theme in chapter 10, and that's the concept of divine guidance.
Okay, so how does the chapter address this idea of, God guiding people towards truth, towards righteousness?
Well, one way is through the story of the prophet Jonah himself.
Oh.
His journey from running away from his mission to eventually coming back to God and being forgiven.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful example of how God guides even those who stray.
It's a reminder that even prophets are human. They make mistakes.
Right.
But God's mercy is always there.
Always available. And, this idea of guidance is expressed more directly in verse 25, where God is described as calling to the abode of peace and guiding whom he wills to a straight path.
So it's like an invitation to a place of peace, of fulfillment.
Right.
But it's up to the individual to accept that invitation.
Exactly. And this notion of accepting guidance is further emphasized in verse 109,
Okay.
where the prophet is advised, "And follow that which has been revealed unto thee, and be patient till God renders judgment, and he is the best of judges."
So encouraging steadfastness.
Yes.
Trusting in God's plan,
Yeah.
even when you face challenges or opposition.
Even when it's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, amidst all of these discussions about faith and disbelief and divine guidance, chapter 10 also spends a lot of time talking about God's attributes
Yeah.
and his relationship with creation.
It does. And one of the most prominent attributes that's emphasized throughout the chapter is just God's absolute power and
Okay.
control over everything.
Right.
This is stated really clearly in verses 55 and 66, both of which proclaim, "Unto God belongs whatsoever is in the heavens and on the earth."
So making it very clear, God is the ultimate authority
The creator and sustainer.
of all that exists. But along with this power, the chapter also emphasizes God's justice
It does.
and mercy.
Absolutely. Like verse 3 assures believers that they will be recompensed with justice, highlighting God's fairness. And then on the other side, verse 27 warns those who do wrong that the recompense of an evil is one like it.
Okay, so actions have consequences.
Exactly.
God holds everyone accountable.
He does.
So it's a very balanced view of God.
Uh-huh.
Powerful and just, but also merciful.
And compassionate. And this idea of divine mercy is beautifully expressed in verse 58,
Okay.
which urges believers to rejoice in the bounty of God and his mercy, suggesting that these are more valuable than anything you could ever possess materially.
It's a reminder to focus on the true riches.
The blessings
Right.
and forgiveness
Things that really matter.
that come from a close relationship with God. Now,
Yeah.
while the chapter emphasizes God's oneness
Right.
and his absolute transcendence, it also directly addresses and refutes certain beliefs that were common at the time.
You're talking about the concept of God having a child.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Verse 68 explicitly rejects this notion.
Okay.
It says, they say, "God has taken a child. Glory be to him. He is the self-sufficient."
So not only refuting that specific belief,
Right.
but also highlighting the danger of trying to put human limitations on God.
Right. ascribing human qualities to the divine.
And this brings us to another interesting element of chapter 10,
Okay.
which is its use of stories
Yes.
from the past
Yes.
to reinforce its message.
Oh, yeah.
We see stories about Noah, Moses, and of course Jonah himself, who gives the chapter its name. What purpose did these stories serve in the overall message?
Well, they're not just historical anecdotes. They're powerful reminders of the consequences of disbelief. Like verses 71 to 73, for example.
Okay.
They describe the destruction of Noah's people.
Right.
And then verses 90 to 92 recount the drowning of Pharaoh.
All right, so they're warnings.
The warnings.
To those who reject God's messengers.
To those who persist in their disbelief. They show that there are consequences.
Real consequences.
To our choices.
Yeah.
Ignoring God's guidance can lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
Now, within these stories, there's also this subtle hint at future religious divisions. Verse 93 mentions that the Israelites received knowledge, and then they differed.
Interesting, isn't it?
It is. It's possible that this is kind of foreshadowing the later split between Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah, like a historical awareness
Yeah.
of how these paths diverged.
It's fascinating to see how these stories are woven into the chapter's message, providing these warnings.
Yeah.
But also these glimmers of hope.
Yeah.
And prompting us to reflect on the choices we make in our own lives. Now, chapter 10 also touches on a bit of a sensitive topic, which is this relationship between God and other deities, other, intermediaries.
Right. Verse 18 addresses this directly. It talks about those who believe in, intercessors with God.
Okay.
Saying they worship apart from God that which neither harms them nor benefits them. And they say, these are our intercessors with God.
So it's like they're trying to create a buffer.
Yeah, like a go-between.
Between themselves and God, relying on these intermediaries.
And the chapter directly challenges that, asking in that same verse, say, would you inform God about something in the heavens or on the earth that he does not know?
Emphasizing God's omniscience. Like, come on, these intermediaries are unnecessary.
Exactly, disrespectful even. It really reinforces the idea of this direct relationship between God and creation. No middlemen needed. This brings us to a question that I think comes up a lot when we're talking about God's attributes and his relationship with creation, and that's the whole concept of free will. How does chapter 10 approach this complicated issue?
Well, it's a question that people have debated for centuries, and chapter 10 doesn't give us a simple, straightforward answer.
No, it doesn't.
On the one hand, you have verses which states, and if God should hasten for mankind evil, even as they would hasten for themselves good, their appointed term would have been concluded.
So that kind of suggests a level of predetermination.
Right, like our destinies are already set. But then, on the other hand, you have verses like verse 41, which really emphasize human choice, responsibility. It says, and if they deny these, say, unto me my deeds and unto you your deeds, you are quit of that which I do, and I am quit of that which you do.
So it's acknowledging both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
God's ultimate control, but also, the reality of our own actions.
It's a complex picture.
It is.
Maybe it's saying that it's not an either situation.
Yeah.
But this kind of complex interplay between divine decree
It's a dance.
and human choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it really highlights the richness, the depth of the Quranic text, which often presents these multiple layers of meaning and invites us to kind of grapple with that.
To engage with these complexities.
Now, chapter 10 packs a lot in. We've talked about, the origins of the Quran, the nature of faith,
God's attributes.
the stories of the prophets, and we're just getting started. There's so much more to uncover.
Absolutely. Let's maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the more, the personal advice that chapter 10 gives, especially to believers, about how to actually live a more righteous and fulfilling life.
Okay, yeah. So moving from like the big grand theological ideas to the more practical stuff, the day-to-day, what kind of guidance does chapter 10 give us there?
Well, I think one of the key themes that kind of runs throughout the chapter is this idea of patience and perseverance.
Okay.
Especially when you're faced with challenges, with opposition.
Right. So it's not always going to be easy.
No.
You're gonna be tested. You're gonna hit those rough patches.
Yeah. And in verse 109, for instance, it advises, and follow that which has been revealed unto thee, and be patient till God renders judgment, and he is the best of judges.
And this message of patience, it's kind of beautifully illustrated through the stories of the prophets that we were talking about.
Yeah.
You think about Moses and and the Israelites, their exodus from Egypt
Yeah.
and their years wandering in the desert, that was filled with hardship, with uncertainty.
And yet they didn't give up.
They kept going.
They trusted in God's plan. I think that's a powerful lesson for us.
Yeah, like when we face those tough times in our own lives,
We can remember their example.
right, draw strength from their perseverance.
And speaking of Moses, there's this fascinating detail in verse 87 that I always find interesting. It's where God instructs Moses and his brother, appoint for thy people houses in Egypt, and make your houses places of worship, and perform the prayer, and give glad tidings unto the believers.
It's interesting that it emphasizes houses of worship, like within their own homes.
Yeah, it's almost like saying that, spirituality, it's not confined to mosques or churches or temples. You can cultivate it anywhere.
Right, in your own space.
Yeah, in the ordinary spaces of your life.
Like turn your home into a sanctuary, a place where you can connect,
Exactly.
find peace, nurture your faith.
Yeah. And this connects to the idea of personal responsibility that we were talking about before.
Right, like faith isn't just something you do on a certain day or in a certain building. It's part of you. It should be woven into, every aspect of your life.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership, making it a living, breathing part of your existence.
And then chapter 10 goes on to give us this other piece of advice, which is contemplate the wonders of creation.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 101 just says simply, observe that which is in the heavens and on the earth.
Just pay attention.
Yeah, to really see the world.
With fresh eyes.
With fresh eyes, exactly. And it's more than just appreciating the beauty of nature. It's about seeing the hand of the Creator.
Yeah.
In everything, from the vastness of the cosmos to smallest details of, a tiny insect.
Like we're surrounded by signs of God's power, of his wisdom.
Of his artistry. And, that contemplation, that awareness, it can really deepen our faith, inspire awe, gratitude, strengthen that connection.
Right, to the divine. So far we've talked about, cultivating that patience.
Yeah.
Perseverance.
Yeah.
Making your home into that sanctuary, reflecting on creation. What other practical advice do we get in chapter 10?
Well, you see this theme recurring.
Okay.
About staying patient, steadfast, even when you're facing, hostility or ridicule.
Yeah.
Verse 108 instructs the prophet and say, O mankind, now has the truth come unto you from your Lord. So whosoever chooses to follow the right path follows it for the good of his own soul, and whosoever chooses to go astray goes astray to its detriment. And I am not a keeper over you.
It's like each person is ultimately responsible for their own choices.
Exactly.
We can't force anyone to believe.
You can present the truth.
Right.
But it's up to them to decide.
Yeah.
And even when you're facing, that rejection, that opposition, stay respectful. Don't get sucked into those pointless arguments, the insults.
It's about conveying the message.
With wisdom.
With compassion.
Yeah.
Not trying to win a debate or prove someone wrong.
And you see this beautifully expressed in verse 41, where the prophet is told to respond to those who deny him by saying, Unto me my deeds, and unto you your deeds. You are quit of that which I do, and I am quit of that which you do.
Wow. It's like a declaration of personal responsibility. Like, I'm not going to get caught up in the blame game. I'm going to focus on my own actions. And this idea is emphasized again in verse 107, where it says, And if God should touch thee with adversity, there is none to remove it save he. And if he touches thee with good fortune, then he is potent over all things.
Right. We don't always understand the reasons for our trials, our hardships, but we should trust.
Trust in God's plan.
Yeah. Even when things seem difficult or unfair.
Yeah. And this idea of trust, it connects back to what we were talking about earlier about anxiety, worry. How does chapter 10, how does it deal with those very human emotions?
Well, verse 59 states, Say, have you considered that which God has bestowed upon you of his bounty, and you have made some of it unlawful and some lawful? Say, has God given you permission for this? Or do you invent a lie against God? And to me, this is saying that, a lot of our anxiety or worry, it comes from our own choices, from our own actions.
It's like when we deviate from God's guidance.
Yeah, we try to control things that are ultimately beyond our control. We overstep the boundaries that God has set for us. And then we create all this stress, all this worry.
Right. Yeah. It's self-inflicted in a way.
Yeah. And, the chapter offers this really simple but profound antidote.
Okay. What's that?
Remember God. Seek his help.
It's cultivating that awareness of God's presence.
Right.
turning to him in prayer,
In supplicare.
fabrication.
Both in times of need.
Yeah.
In times of gratitude.
Yeah, and that remembrance, that connection, it can bring such peace,
Yeah.
such tranquility. So chapter 10 has given us a lot to think about.
Mm.
You know, we've talked about patience, perseverance. We've talked about creating that sanctuary in your own home, reflecting on creation, being sincere, being truthful, responding to opposition with wisdom, with compassion, trusting in God's plan, remembering him constantly. I mean, it's a lot.
You've really captured the essence.
It's not just about these abstract concepts.
No.
It's about practical guidance for how to live a meaningful life.
In chapter 10, it's not just this collection of stories, of instructions. It's a guidebook for living a more meaningful life, a life that's rooted in faith, in gratitude, in a deep awareness of God's presence.
And with that, we've covered a lot in our exploration of chapter 10, Jonah.
We have.
But there's one key aspect that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the concept of Hanif.
Oh, you're right. You're right. This term is introduced in verse 105.
Yeah.
And it's really crucial for understanding the message of the chapter. It's called to this pure and uncorrupted form of monotheism.
So what does Hanif actually mean? Why is it so important here?
Well, Hanif it's got this rich history and multiple interpretations, but at its core, it refers to this primordial monotheism. A pure, unadulterated belief in one God that predates all the established religions.
Okay.
It's like recognizing God's oneness. It's embedded in our very being. It's a natural inclination to worship the Creator. And in verse 105, the prophet is told to set thy face toward the religion as a Hanif, and be thou not among the idolaters.
So it's a call to return to that pure and simple faith.
Yeah, stripping away all the man-made stuff that's accumulated over time.
Right, like get back to basics, remember the core.
Exactly.
Don't get bogged down in the unnecessary complexities.
Right, and this call to embrace Hanif, it's especially relevant in chapter 10, which is all about emphasizing God's oneness.
His transcendence, the pointlessness of worshiping anything other than him.
Yeah, right. So it's not just about believing in one God, but it's about living a life that's in harmony with that belief.
Yeah, a life that's free from idolatry.
From hypocrisy.
Rooted in sincerity, in truthfulness, in that deep connection with the Creator.
You got it. And this call to embrace Hanif, it's not just some historical instruction. It's a timeless message that speaks to anyone, who's seeking that authentic,
that real, genuine connection
with God. Now, chapter 10, it strongly advocates for this pure form of monotheism, but it also acknowledges that there are people who oppose this message, who cling to their disbelief, to their rejection of God's guidance.
So chapter 10, it's not only presenting this really powerful case for the truth of the Quran and the importance of embracing Hanif, but it's acknowledging the complexity of human psychology.
Yeah, the challenge.
And the challenges of communicating with people who hold different beliefs.
Absolutely. And this nuanced, this multifaceted approach, that's part of what makes chapter 10 so compelling, so enduring. It speaks to our hearts, to our minds. It invites us to reflect, to question, and ultimately to choose the path that leads us closer to truth, to righteousness.
So we've covered a lot in chapter 10. We've talked about the nature of faith and disbelief. We've talked about dealing with disagreements, navigating those tough times, and finding that solace in remembering God. I mean, it's been a true deep dive.
It has. And it's incredible how chapter 10 brings all of this wisdom together, guidance that's both timeless and relevant, profound and practical.
So for those listening, we encourage you to spend some time with chapter 10. Read it, reflect on it, and see what it has to say to you. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.